How do you make sense of the U.S. position in these negotiations? Because Trump is, of course, famous for going a bit back and forth, and it also seems a bit bizarre, the U.S. position, because now the U.S. is seemingly the main negotiator trying to bring this war to an end. But it was the U.S. that pushed the Europeans back in 2008 on offering future membership to Ukraine. It was the U.S. who took the lead in toppling Yanukovych in 2014. It was the U.S. that took the lead in undermining the Minsk peace agreement and then the Istanbul talks. And today it's the U.S. generals doing most of the war planning. Ukraine is full of CIA agents. It's the U.S. intelligence agencies giving the targeting, primarily using American weapons, and this is still a U.S.-led proxy war, irrespective of Trump trying to give it over to Biden. So yet Trump is the mediator here. He might be genuine though that he wants this war to end as he sees a disaster, or he could just be trying to outsource it to the Europeans. But even as he mediates, though, the sanctions on countries like India are being imposed in efforts to cripple the Russian economy, and he either ignores or assists the Europeans in attacks on Russia. So there's even the civilian vessels. So I mean, you are a former U.S. Army officer. How do you make sense of the U.S. position in this? Well, let's call it a diplomatic circus, because this it doesn't feel very genuine to me that if they would want to shut this thing down, they could. And I do understand that they don't want to give up the pressure yet against Russia, as they can use this as leverage in any negotiations. But still, it's been a year of the Trump administration, and they're still leading this war. So what are we looking at here?
For future historians, say in 150 years, 200 years, before they start studying these last 5 years and probably or last maybe even longer, if you really want to go back to where it starts and the next couple of years where it goes, I would highly suggest binging on Monty Python's Flying Circus, because this is basically like the most absurd episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus. For those that haven't watched this, maybe I'm dating myself, but I highly suggest watching some reruns and then watching the news. It will make much more sense. The absurd of the absurd is what we have from the West in general. Uh, you know, Anybody with half a intellectual node in their head would have figured out that one of the biggest targets of all of this was the European Union to begin with. The destruction of the European Union, the willful self-destruction of the European Union. And that's exactly what we have. Um, Europe, the European Union is not going to negotiate. They're negotiation incapable. What they're going to do until they collapse is become more and more tyrannical. We see this right now. Sanctioning of European citizens, sanctioning of Swiss citizens. For what? For telling the truth. For telling the truth of what is going on. This is, you know, the USSR and their unelected Politburo, otherwise known as Commissioner van der Leyen, or the State Secretary van der Leyen. There, um, actually, I think the Politburo had more of a democratic process in getting elected than the European Commission. They have taken everything that was worst about the USSR, and implemented that, and none of the good things like taking care of the people, 48-hour work weeks, vacations for people, medical treatment for people. They just dropped all of that anchorage. Why bother with that ballast? We'll just keep the good stuff. How we rule tyrannically over everybody. So I don't think they're capable of negotiating. The people definitely around Vander Lane are, and I don't think the people that could replace her are capable of that. They are ideologues. They've sold themselves uh, fully sold their souls to this mission, whether they realize it or not. But that's exactly how they're acting. And people can do that very easily. They get so invested in something that they cannot take that one step back, let alone the 10 step and you take back and take a look at the big picture. That Europe was always the one of the major targets. It's like, World War I, World War II, the British aim wasn't just the destruction of the Germans, it was the destruction of the Germans and the Russians. They're playing a bigger game. The U.S. is playing a bigger game in this. That the U.S. is now playing both the main controller and the empower of the proxy, and the guys that are the neutral negotiators. Again, this is something straight out of Monty Python. I don't think Monty Python are going to come up with something this hilarious. You're looking at people, Trump is talking about we're neutral. You're neutral. You're giving them all the military intelligence they need. You're still giving them equipment. Yeah, the U.S. is still sending equipment for money that Europe someday will pay, maybe. So they're still providing equipment. There's even line items in the direct Pentagon budget for Ukraine. It was modest, of course, compared to previous years. It was only about $800 million, but it's there. And there's always supplemental budgets. They never forget that the U.S. military and the U.S. government in general runs on a lot of supplemental budgets. So if it's $900 billion is the main budget for the War Department, the supplemental budgets could easily come to several hundred $1 billion more easily, and they'll be ad hoc passed here and there. So you're looking at a side that really is trying just to hedge its bets. I don't think it's given up on Project Ukraine as a whole, no matter what Trump is saying. I don't believe. Sorry, maybe a lot of Russian news media don't like what I've had to say before because I am very critical on Trump, and they all for some reason want to believe that maybe this time with the U.S. President Trump and something like that. Well, like gentlemen, this is, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the end. This is only, if nothing else, a regrouping. Project Ukraine has not been abandoned. The U.S. has not abandoned its desire on hegemony over the world, no matter what its new strategy, official strategy is. And if you look at the official strategy, they still talk about possible threats to Europe and to other areas where they can't leave totally because our interests are still involved. Meanwhile, just reinforcing that we're going to rape the Western Hemisphere as much as we want, like we've done for the last 140 years before that. So where's this going to go? I don't know. I honestly don't know. From the Russian side, I think that they're finally just running out of any desire to even participate in this farce. It's going to be settled on the battlefield. What's going to happen to the European Union? I think at least a few countries are probably going to go, thanks, we've had enough, we're leaving. Will they be allowed to leave like the British were? I don't know. The European Union was much more democratic when the British had their exit. Would the Hungarians or the Slovakians be able to leave? I don't know. I honestly don't know at this point, because if they start to go, that could have a cascading effect on the European Union as a whole. And those powers that be that are sitting up in Brussels, they don't want to lose power. And the more power they grab, the more desperate they become. Let me just look at what they're doing to European citizens. Again, sanctions inside of their own countries. They can't buy, they can't earn, they can't sell, they can't have gifts. I mean, this is worse than putting somebody in a concentration camp. At least worse than putting them in a prison. At least in prison, he gets food and board. Here, you're a non-entity; they can't do anything. So a union never came up with anything that tyrannical. Well, I'm not going to talk about the 1920s, the 30s when they had gulags, but I'm sure those are probably on around the corner. That's usually the next step. Well, we can't keep these people if they're ghosted. We can't keep them in society because they're still talking. They're still coming on podcasts. Why don't we just put them all in one place? And then the next logical steps go from that. We know how this play plays out. It's been played out several times before. And I don't see the European Union hitting the brakes anytime soon. I don't see the desire.
Well, the U.S. playing all sides is a common theme, though. In 1941, before Harry Truman took the presidency, there's this quote he had in the New York Times where he said that, if the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. If the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans, and that way let them kill each other, as many as possible. And this is
Yes.
kind of as long as both are weakened, we win. And again, and it's not exactly the same now, but the logic is still the same. You can destroy, for example, Nord Stream. You weaken the Europeans, and in their weakness, make them more dependent on the U.S., make them more obedient. I mean, look where the EU is now. 20 years ago, in terms of GDP, there was some parity between the U.S. and the EU. Now, there's nothing. What remains of a deindustrializing Europe is being now, lured over to the United States with all these subsidies, and it's quite remarkable. And as the Europeans are allowed the privilege of buying American weapons to fight a war, which the Americans were the main one pushing for. All the Americans want in return is for Europeans to buy American energy, much, much more expensive. And what remains of money should be invested in the United States, as per a deal the EU had to sign with Trump on his golf course, given that the EU didn't have any leverage. So there is, and again, this hardly falls under a conspiracy theory when Trump himself comes out and said the EU is worse than China, and he hates nothing more than China, seemingly. So that would be the European. So it is quite remarkable, but it does beg the question, though. What do you think is how do you interpret the European position? Because this is a very strange thing for me, because the Europeans, again, they're the one, as said before, resisted the US push towards this disaster in 2008 when they warned Bush that don't offer membership to Ukraine. First of all, there's only 20% of them who want it, and it's going to be war. Angela Merkel said this. This would be interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war. And the predictable thing happened. It blew up in our faces. We have a war. We're losing that war. The US is really sees what's written on the wall, so they're backing out. Not completely, obviously, but handing over responsibility to the Europeans and try to make some money of it as they outsource it. It's just, and there's no course correction. It's quite shocking. And I always feel like I should make some excuses for the EU, but after what they did to Colonel Jacques Beau of the Swiss Army, like, if you read his books, watched his interviews, he just relies on Western sources to give the best analysis, which was his job as a colonel. He did the intelligence analysis, and then, based on interpreting reality as it is, advocates for the best policies. His assessments have been correct. No one can catch him on any of the facts or the analysis he does. And the policies, therefore, he recommended would have kept us away from this war. It would have saved Europe. It would have saved Ukraine. That's not what the Europeans did. Yet they sanctioned him. He can't travel. They seized his bank accounts. A colonel, which used to work with NATO. This is just, it's so dark. I mean, for me, this is a big nail in the coffin of the EU, and they did this to themselves. It's shocking. But anyways, my question was, how do you make sense of this? Because if you're losing a war, the deal is going to be worse tomorrow than it is today. Why would you still want to prolong this? It is a difficult thing to comprehend, I think.
Well, depends on which Europeans. So if you take the 160 million called Russians and Belarusians, well, the Belarusians are kind of and still in pseudo-neutral mode. The 150 million Russian Europeans, mostly Europeans, are looking at it and going, "We'll settle this on the battlefield." I think the 18 or 19 million Ukrainians are split between those psychotically wishing to fight to the end and those are just wishing for this to be over in any which way possible. As for the rest of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, because Ukraine itself, it's a three-tier society, the three-tier war. You have the lower middle class and lower, they're the ones fighting and dying because they can't afford to buy their way out. The middle class has bought their way out, become refugees, and are now the uber patriots to fight to the very last Ukrainian because it's not them. And then the rich are just partying everywhere they want to party. They don't give a damn. It's all a good party. They've stolen so much money. They're willing to spend it on the poor Central and Western Europeans and their resorts by buying up their trinkets and buying up their services. Here, come over here, French servant, come bring me my drink because I'm the rich Ukrainian. So it's a very different society, very tiered society. As for the Austro-Hungarian contingent, well, the Austrians so far are still pro-war, but the Conservative Party did win the majority. I think they're going to have the uber majority in the next election, so they'll be out and they'll follow the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Slovaks out the door and saying goodbye. We're not going to fight this war no matter what, which is going to be a hit for NATO too. If you think about it, those armies are not going to fight. Well, and Austria is neutral anyways. Well, not NATO. If for NATO itself, the Turks aren't going to fight. I'm not calling them Europeans, but they're not going to fight. The Greeks will have a revolution. The Bulgarians will have a revolution. the Romanians may have a revolution because they did actually vote not to have any of this, and their elections were stolen, as we saw blatantly. The Italians are starting to distance themselves. I think they figured out that they're standing in a precipice, and their toes are already hanging over the cliff, and it's just a nice gust of wind, and they're going back over that cliff. But Italy has rarely finished a war on the same side it started it. It's like hasn't ever. So there's that. Matter of fact, when I was in Bosnia, the Italians were the first ones to have Velcro patches, and the joke was it may piss off some of the Italians that know me. Sorry, but that was the joke that we had was the reason to have Velcro patches because Italy's finished every world war on a different side than it started on, so they could quickly switch patches. Whose side are we on today? Oh, okay, new patch, and then we go forward. The well, what come and then when you get down to the others, well, Germany is a good question because while everybody focuses on the alternative future for Deutschland being 27% and probably higher, there's a flip side to that. The rest, so around 70%, they give their voice to any other party, are giving their voices to war. The majority of the population still wants war. Whether they fully realize that or not, that's a separate issue. But they're voting for war. That's that, and the problem. And now you're getting into the problem of the Scandinavians, the pre-Balts, the Poles, and the Northern Europeans, and the leadership that runs in the EU-SSR Politburo in Brussels. The last thing they desperately can accept is any actual peace in Ukraine, because if there's an actual peace and borders are set, and the conflict ends, what have they got left to unify the bankrupt, corrupt, degenerated, socially degenerate, infrastructurally crumbling, economically destroyed European Union? Without the Red Scare, if you want to call it the Russian Scare. Okay, so the Russians have just concluded a peace treaty. Everybody's backing off. They got a hard border. The war is over. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. Well, that doesn't work anymore. Oh, why did we bankrupt your economy? Why are your children going hungry by week 3? By the way, that's the average Italian these days. I have several friends in Italy that in Italian politics I've talked to, and they're like, the average Italian can't is deciding to heat his home or feed himself and his family by week 3 of the month, and it's only getting worse. Try explaining that. Meloni, by the way, who's number 1 cheerleader for NATO after she got elected, now has to explain why we gave a lot of equipment, maybe had quite a few Italians killed. The French have definitely been getting killed, and the Poles have been getting killed, and so have the Germans while we're at it, and bankrupt their economy. Let's see. I don't know. What answer are they going to say? We put everything on red 5, so even if it was red 6, it wasn't a win, and we didn't get red 5. In fact, the roulette wheel just went away, and the ball flew off somewhere, and we're just stuck with our bets on red 5 getting taken away. So we're all bankrupt now. Thanks. We're going to leave for America. And I'm sure quite a few of those leaders probably will leave for America or Canada or somewhere else, run for their lives with their money. I don't see how the European Union gets out of this alive, at least not in the form that it is now, unless it goes full Third Reich tyranny. Concentration camps, gulags are war camps. I'm talking straight up concentration camps, full repression, full on everything. That's the last desperate hold on power. And the weaker the government, often, or the weaker they feel, the more harsh their terms are toward their own population, because they have to crush anything that looks or smells like dissent. And that's what we're seeing in the EU. It's revving up. They're getting more desperate every single day. And you're right about the colonel. Now, there was a Turkish journalist. I cannot remember his name right now in Germany. He's a perfect example. He's Turkish by race. He is German, born in Germany, and he's sanctioned. The man is living basically. He's been ghosted. He's not the only one. There was, by the way, another Swedish journalist. She's been sanctioned too. She's in Africa. She can't fly into Switzerland because she has to fly over European Union territory. So now she can't go home. So we're looking at and this is right now. It's starting at the top level. They're grabbing the dissidents, the bigger dissidents, but it's going to go further down low. which we already see in England. By the way, England is well ahead by at least a few years of the European Union. England is on full-on tyranny. Anything you say, I mean, look at George Galloway. For God's sakes, the man was a part of Parliament for 30 years. He's head of a recognized registered political party, and he and his wife were coming in, and they were detained, which is worse than being arrested, because arrested at least you get a solicitor. Here, you're detained, you get no solicitor, you get nothing. You are at the mercy of the state because you're not arrested. You're detained. Just in detention, we can do anything we want, basically. You have no rights. I mean, the UK is a full tyrant, but I don't think that's going to go for the rest of the EU. I don't think there's an off ramp for them, because any off ramp is a loss of power, and probably a loss of the EU, at least as we see it now. It'll have to be reformed somehow. I don't think these people are ready to let go, especially the money that they're making. I mean, they're all making money. Let's not forget that. They have power, they have money, they have prestige, at least in their circles. That's very hard to give up.